Oh. No, sorry. Sorry, yeah.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is the inaugural Oral History Coffee Chat for the DC Oral History Collaborative. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome again. My name is Jasper Collier, and I'm the Oral History Project Manager for Humanities DC, heading up the DC Oral History Collaborative Project. I'd like to thank Billy Sanders and Rhonda Cunningham for providing ASL interpretive services for us this morning. I'd also like to thank Tracy Mullery, my colleague, for setting up the webinar and helping everything to run as smoothly as possible. I would also like to thank our panelists, Adelle Banks and Kelvin Childs, who have joined us to talk about their project, the Asbury United Methodist Church Oral History Project today. But before I introduce them, I just want to talk a little bit about kind of the outline for the program. What we want to do today is certainly learn a little bit more about Adelle and Kelvin's work with the Asbury United Methodist Church Oral History Project. We want to learn about the impact of that project and the work they did. We also want to learn about their process, find out a little bit more about how or what goes into creating oral histories and doing oral history interviewing. And so, to that end, we will have a little bit of a chance, hopefully, to hear them play some clips from the oral histories that they did, talk a little bit about their project, and then we'll have a conversation, we'll ask some questions, and we'll learn a little bit more. And at the end of the program, we also want to have a Q&A session where, all of you in the audience participating will have the chance to ask questions either about the Asbury United Methodist Church project, about the oral history process, or about what support the DC Oral History Collaborative can offer. I'll note that, when we get to that Q&A part, when we start soliciting questions from participants, if you could put those in the Q&A, if you kind of go down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see that you have an option for the Q&A. Please put your questions in there, or if you would like to speak and ask your question, you can raise your hand and Tracy is on and she will be able to call on you so that you can ask your question. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. Adelle Banks is a freelance oral history interviewer and videographer who has conducted and recorded oral history since 2011, primarily focused on African-American history and African-American religious history. She directed the Asbury UMC DC Oral Histories podcast in 2020, and she's also an award-winning veteran journalist. And Kelvin Childs is a freelance writer and editor. He wrote successful applications for the DC Oral History Collaborative grants in 2018 and 2019 and in 2020, actually. And he wrote a successful application that year for a public projects grant that supported the Asbury UMC DC Oral Histories podcast project. He's also been a volunteer grant reviewer for Humanities DC. So we're definitely looking forward to hearing more from Adelle and Kelvin about their project. But as I mentioned, they did receive funding and support for that project through the DC Oral History Collaborative. I just want to take a moment to talk about the collaborative and what it offers. Since 2017, the DC Oral History Collaborative has supported dozens of projects across the city and for about many different communities across Washington, DC. Many of those projects are now available in the DC Public Library's online catalog, Dig DC. DCOHC offers grants for new projects. It offers extension grants for existing projects. And like the grant that was awarded for the 2020 Asbury UMC podcast, it offers funding for projects that use existing oral history collections. The DC Oral History Collaborative also offers several different training modules. We have one of them coming up at the end of this month. If you go to Humanities DC's Facebook page, that first training workshop of the year is now available for registration. So I definitely recommend, if you're interested in learning more about how to conduct oral histories with your community, with your families, your friends, your neighbors, please take a look at that workshop option and join us if you can. So with that, I will note that we are having Yeah, as is often the case with some of these virtual programs, we're experiencing some technical difficulties and we're having a little bit of trouble getting Adelle and Kelvin's video online. But we are hoping they'll be able to join us on audio and share their clips just the same. So with that, I'll actually ask Adelle and Kelvin to come on as much as is possible and to provide us with a little background on the Asbury United Methodist Church Oral History Project. And hopefully we'll be able to listen to some of the clips from their interview collection. Adelle and Kelvin.
Hi there. Can you hear us all right?
Yep, we can hear you.
I'm Adelle Banks, Director of Asbury UMC DC Oral Histories Podcast Project. I started conducting oral histories of Asburyans in 2014, and by 2017 had completed 17, including Bishop in Residence Forrest Stith, lay members, educators, DC government employees, and people active on different levels of the United Methodist Church. My primary goal was to share the history of DC, African Americans, and the nation from the perspective of people who have sat in the pews of Asbury United Methodist Church. Our church is one of the oldest Black churches in DC and has always been located at 11th and K Streets Northwest. It was founded in 1836 by free and enslaved Black people who were former members of Foundry United Methodist Church. Thanks to the DC Oral History Collaborative and the work of a team of Asburyans, we now have 26 people who've been interviewed. And for the latest segment of our project, we had a grant that paid for transcripts of the earlier interviews. I reviewed these transcripts and shared them with our church historian, James Wright, and we decided which ones would be featured in the podcast. And I created scripts for them, which James then reviewed. I then edited the audio of the original interviews and produced 5 podcast episodes, each featuring a person we have interviewed. They are a distillation of the full interviews with portions I hope would be enlightening for a general audience. So now I'm going to introduce Kelvin Childs, who was the narrator on the podcast episodes and the writer of the grant applications and the person in charge of publicity for the podcast.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kelvin Childs, the grant writer for Asbury United Methodist Church. And while the Asbury Oral History Project was underway, we learned about the DC Oral History Collaborative and that they're offering funding for this work. So I attended a workshop with other applicants and learned that the DCOHC is a partnership of Humanities DC, the Historical Society of Washington, DC, and the DC Public Library. And one part of their charge was to create a directory of sites around the district that have oral history collections and share their work. Asbury applied for a DC Oral History Collaborative grant in 2017, but it was not approved. In 2018, we applied again, and with the help of Megan Lemire of the DCOHC, we learned how to make a better case for the worthiness of our work. This grant was approved, allowing us to add 5 narratives to Asbury's collection. In 2019, we applied for another DC Oral History Collaborative grant, which was approved, allowing us to add 5 more narratives. For 2020, we were advised to apply in a different category for public projects or events. And the aim was to find a way to share the narratives in our collection with a bigger audience. After some brainstorming, we chose the podcast project, and our funding request allowed us to make transcripts of the narratives that we did not have transcripts for. And with those, we could select the best material for the podcast or for other future uses. So the 5 narrators included in our podcast are Bill Johnson, former DC Department of Environmental Services Director, Josephine Baker, a longtime educator in DC Public Schools and a founding member of the DC Public Charter School Board. Cardell Richardson, a retired Air Force colonel and an executive for more than a decade at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. The late James Adelle, a longtime public educator in Washington, DC, and the late Sandra Kingshaw, an employee of the Girl Scouts in the Washington, DC area for more than 25 years.
So now we're going to try to play a couple of clips for you to give you a sense of our oral history work and specifically the podcast episodes that highlight parts of those oral histories. The first episode of our podcast featured Bill Johnson, and I'm going to try to play a portion of that interview. If you'll hold on for a moment for us to switch things around to do just that. So hold on, please.
Life in Washington, D.C., and in American history.
Back in 1963, after the March on Washington, President Kennedy ordered the D.C. commissioners, there were three. We did not have a mayor then. We had three commissioners running the city. And President Kennedy ordered those three commissioners to do a high-profile job of recruiting and hiring Afro-Americans in professional jobs. And I, as a result, became the recipient of that. I was one of many who were hired from that presidential edict. As a matter of fact, I became the first Afro-American engineering construction inspector for the old Department of Sanitary Engineering. I went to work the first week in September of '63, just 2 weeks following the March on Washington and the presidential edict to the commissioners. I was a direct beneficiary of that, and I kind of had somewhat of a celebrity status because I was the only black engineering construction inspector they had. They since got more, but I was the first one.
So before you tell me more about that,
Yes.
I want to go back to something you just said,
Sure.
which is March on Washington.
Mhm.
Were you part of it? What was your role in it? If you were, what do you remember of that time in Washington and at the march?
I had, I guess, 15 or 20 close friends at that time, and we all decided that we were going to gather at 7th and E Northeast at one of our friends' homes, have breakfast, and then walk to the march site. And we did just that. Long walk from 7th and E Northeast all the way to the Lincoln Memorial. And but we did, and we made it, and we had a good time. And we were in this classic march down Constitution Avenue once we got our placards and signs. It was a great day. I never, ever will forget it.
Do you remember what your placard said or any of your signs?
Jobs, jobs, jobs. And I didn't know I was going to be a recipient of jobs in the district government. I mean, I didn't even consider the district government because things were kind of backward back then.
Do you remember the crowd? Do you remember the speeches?
Oh yeah. The crowds were overwhelming. I happened to be, our group, we decided to be on the southwest end of the reflecting pool as close to the steps as we could get. So we were right on the corner of the reflecting pool and the steps in front of the monument. And it was a great day. I never will forget it.
And everyone remembers or recalls I Have a Dream speech by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Is that something that stands out most for you or something else?
Well, that stood out as well, but there were other speeches that I thought deserved a lot of merit. Congressman from Georgia.
John Lewis?
John Lewis. I thought his speech was right on time, despite the fact that they made him rewrite it several times before they would accept and let him read it and deliver it. But it was just a great time. A lot of singing and rejoicing, but we had no idea that Martin Luther King was going to give such an epic sermon speech that day. It was all a surprise.
All right, so I hope you all could hear that all right. Great. So we are now going to play a portion of one other interview, and that is of Sandra Kingshaw, who passed away in 2019. It focuses on her various connections with the Girl Scouts, and I will get ready to share that one with you next.
Merit performance.
Sandra Kingshaw described what it was like to be the first African American to serve as an area manager at the Girl Scout Council where she worked.
And Girl Scouts had never had anybody of color.
Was that challenging at times?
To me, I had run for office. I had gone into places where they weren't looking for anybody whose skin was even palely white, let alone black. So no, I'd already gotten all that done. I had met with people who would blink, and I'd blink back. One time, I was staffing a position because I didn't have a field director, and this was in Southern Maryland. And one of the volunteers from there said to me, came into my office, he said, "I know you're meeting with our folks tonight," this white guy in a all-white group. He said, "When you come, could you kind of be humble?" I said, "What?" He said, "Could you kind of be?" I said, "What does that mean?" And he said, what do you mean? I said, "Well, let me tell you something. I go down on my knees before my Lord. Beyond that, nobody else. So I don't know what you're expecting, but if that's what you're looking for, that's not going to happen tonight." He said, "Okay, I'm sorry to hear that. Can we meet with your executive director?" I said, "Absolutely." So I called the CEO and called to ask her. Now, this was the interim. "Can we come up?" She said, "Absolutely." So I said, "Would you like me to step out?" He said, "No." So he said to her, he told her, that I asked Mrs. Kingshaw, we were having this meeting, yada, yada, yada. I asked her if she would please be humble. And she said, and the CEO said, and what did she say? She said that she was not going to go on her knees for anybody except her Lord. And she said, "That's the right answer." He said, but she said, "That's the right answer. We don't expect our employees to be humble." She said, I don't know what you were expecting her to say, but she gave the correct answer. Be humble. Be humble? I don't do humble. I do humble before God, and that's it.
This was a man affiliated with the Girl Scouts.
Oh, yeah, we have guys working with Girl Scouts.
Asking you to do this at a Girl Scout gathering.
Yes.
Meeting.
Yes. I said, no.
So full circle here related to the Girl Scouts.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see a connection between your being a Brownie at Asbury United Methodist Church and the first troop to the extent of work you ended up doing as an employee for the council?
I don't think so. I think because I stayed in Girl Scouting all of my childhood through high school. Maybe. I just had never thought about it. So maybe. We did things that Girl Scouts, that young black girls didn't do. And Girl Scouting in D.C. was connected through church. Now you find them in schools, you find them, but then they were in black churches.
What did you do that black girls didn't do as in scouting? What do you mean?
I don't know. I mean, black girls... People hadn't thought about having black girls do anything except church stuff and some school things. But Girl Scouting was perceived by everybody to be white. And you mean you have black Girl Scouts? You have black girls who are Girl Scouts? Uh-huh. Oh. But what do y'all do? Same thing you do. I use the same handbook you do. Make the same pledge you make. Oh. And it took a while. When people say to me, "Nothing has changed," I go, "You're wrong. You're so wrong. There's more that needs to change, but a whole lot of stuff has changed in my lifetime. And imagine in the lifetimes of the people who preceded us. There's a lot that needs to change, but a whole lot has changed in a few short years. And stuff is changing as we speak."
All right, back to you, Jasper.
Thank you so much to both of you for sharing those clips. I think it gives great insight into the power of the stories that we've been able to collect, over the years for the Asbury United Methodist Church Oral History Project. So, what we want to do now is kind of move to a moderated conversation. I have some questions here that I'd like to ask Adelle and Kelvin about their project and its development, in the process that they went through for, getting some of these narratives collected from church members. So I guess, if I could just start with, finding out a little bit about kind of what sparked the initial kind of thought to begin an oral history project for the church. I know that, you all have been collecting for quite a few years now, even before the DC Oral History Collaborative started. Can you tell us, a little bit about what motivated the project initially? And, has the impetus for the project changed over the years? I know it's gone through several iterations, or has it been refined over time?
Yeah, we have had an interest at Asbury in the stories of our elders for a long time. We have an archives and history committee that was in particular hoping that we could collect these stories in some way. And I have my own personal passion and interest in doing this kind of work. Initially, Asbury was particularly interested in its own history and people's involvements in certain ministries and how different ministries developed over the years. And that sort of became refined to be more about their stories more in total. And the questions changed over time to be more of a life story interview as opposed to just looking at what they did for the church. But the biggest thing was just getting to have people tell their own stories while they could. And we have lost many of our older members and missed the opportunity to have them share their stories with us and with others. And so that was the main driver of this. And I think that drive has just become stronger as people have gotten older.
Thank you. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I know that that's common for a lot of oral history projects. But it definitely seems like just from my experience listening to the oral histories that there is definitely a great mix between stories that are told about your narrator's life within the church and stories that are related to some of the work that they've done in the larger community as well. So I definitely think you've been able to reach multiple goals with the oral history project. So that kind of brings me to the next question. Within the church community, how has the oral history project been received?
This is Kelvin. Our project has been very well received within the church community, and everyone is very pleased that we are able to capture these stories and share them with our membership. After the first and second time we collected interviews, we held a showcase event in our fellowship hall. And the first time we did, we had all 5 of the narrators present. And the second time we did, we had four of the 5 narrators. And we presented clips from their interviews and they took questions directly from the audience about what was said. And each event had more than 50 people. And we got a lot of positive feedback and intended to do the same when we launched the podcast project, but instead had to take that online. And we still reached a sizable audience then.
And when we launched the podcast project, the first time we did a launch event where we just featured some clips from Bill Johnson's interview, and he also was part of the event, so he got to answer additional questions. And then we had a full, and so that was a preview event. Then we had a full launch event in December, and that one we were able to feature clips from the different interviews and include some of the family members of those that we featured who had passed away. So it was really very poignant but informative event. And we've had other people who've been interested in being interviewed as far as within our church community, people that have learned in and outside of the church about certain roles that people have in the church. Like I remember during one of our showcase events with the podcast that somebody responded, never knew all the things ushers did, that they learned more about the workings inside of the church and the people who volunteer for churches. And it was also an opportunity to memorialize some of the people who had passed away. And one other thing I'll mention is if you Google like Asbury United Methodist Church in DC and oral history and showcase, you might be able to see a recording of the showcases if you're interested in how those kinds of events come together.
Well, I think that's great. I mean, being able to have 50 people at the shareback sessions definitely shows a lot of, community engagement and community involvement. And I think that all the different ways you've been able to continue to involve your narrators in those shareback sessions, is really strong as well. I guess, just kind of a follow-on question from that. I definitely kind of have gotten the impression that the two of you both have really been the driving force behind the oral history collecting initiatives. But over the years you've been able to attract other members of the church community to be involved with the oral history project itself and the collecting of the interviews?
Yes, originally I was doing the interviews myself with my camera or my recorder or both. And we have expanded once we were able to get the DC Oral History Collaborative's grant support to more people. So Pandit Wright was an additional interviewer, and she and I each worked with a videographer. She worked with Sandy Adams most of the time, and I worked with Dwayne Williams most of the time. And so when we were doing the interviews, it was more of a team effort and had the opportunity of video as well as audio. And so that was a great benefit. Ruth Robinson was our director for some of the project during those years. And Carol Travis has been a bookkeeper helping us with the keeping track of all the things we need to get back to Jasper for related to the sort of behind the scenes aspects of the grant, the supplies we needed, et cetera. So yes, it has expanded.
And James Wright.
Excuse me, and James Wright, our historian, has been a great resource, as well as members of the Archives and History Committee, but especially in the last go round with the podcast, he was an instrumental part of determining which interviews we should highlight in the podcast, what details were, checking the accuracy of the details. And then of course, Kelvin, being the narrator, was the voice that connected all of the pieces of the podcast as we introduced parts of the interviews. He was the person to help, when we were moving on to another topic and, that kind of thing. So it became a team effort, and that's been really wonderful.
Great. So, one of the great things about, oral history is that it's very accessible. It's accessible to, people who want to tell stories with their families, with their communities, with their neighbors. But nevertheless, we all know that it requires both training and experience to master. So since you all have been doing it for some time now, what valuable lessons have you learned having worked on this project over the years? That you would want to pass on to somebody who's just trying to, think through a new project, who's just starting out with their oral history work?
Okay, well, I got my start in grant writing, in that I am a freelance writer and a journalist, and went to a workshop that was hosted by the Maryland Governor's Grants Office on the basics of grant writing. And I've also taken a different basic course in grants writing that was offered by the District of Columbia Mayor's Office of Partnerships and Grant Services. And there are places you can learn about how to be a grant writer online at candid.org and at grants.gov. And I believe those links will be provided in the chat. I would say the key thing about being a grant writer and seeking grants is that there are organizations that have a desire to provide funding for a particular purpose, and you as an organization have a need. So it's matching the interest with the need. And when you have found someone who has a common interest and a common need, the key thing in making those applications is to pay very close attention to what is being asked in the application and to answer everything that is asked. And that doing that, specifically spelling out this is the way that our need will serve your organization's interests, makes it happen.
And on the oral history side, I'd say that you really need to give ample time for all the various steps. Everything takes longer and is a little more involved than you might think. And that starts with the collecting the materials you need, from the, making a trip to a store or going online and buying the various things you need, whether it's batteries or for our sense, SD cards for the audio recorder originally to get the correct audio recorder that we got good advice from DCOHC on. And then setting up the interviews, first you got to make sure the people that you want to interview are available. You have to work your schedule out with their schedule. Then after you've done the interview, and you've dealt with the transcribing of the interview, which takes a while, or if you have the funding, you may be able to have a company do the transcribing. Either way, once you get the transcript, you have to go over the transcript. And when Pandit Wright and I were working together, we sometimes did the edit audits, it's called, of each other's transcripts to make sure that what we were hearing from the recording is exactly what was on the page of the transcript. And then there's metadata and index work where you are keeping track of the details of the interview for people who might want to check it out later, but not necessarily listen to the whole interview. So they would have some bio information on the person you've interviewed. They'd have information about what was being said during a certain, say, 5-minute portion of the interview. Then you have to make clips. If you're going to have a showcase, it's good to be able to play clips like we just played for you, whether they're audio clips or video clips. And again, I'm just going to say it again, almost everything you do takes longer than you think it's gonna. And you definitely want to take advantage of the training you can get from DCOHC and special workshops they had, like they had one on tips on audio recording, for instance, that, you know, suggested literally turning off some appliances, turning down the phone or off the phone when you're interviewing, both the narrator and the interviewer, and then remembering to turn them all back on before you, when you're done with the interview. But things like that, you just really, there's a lot of detail work to this that help make the project come out well.
Definitely, yeah. There's always, you know, a little bit more to it than I think anybody expects when they first go into, you know, trying to start an oral history project. Was there, you know, one particular, you know, step in the process that, you know, you kind of felt was, you know, the most challenging or the most time consuming, or, you know, kind of perhaps required the most ingenuity to kind of figure out how to get past it or to overcome it?
That's a good question. I mean, in some ways, dealing with the metadata and indexing was particularly challenging because you had to sort of pull out what were the most compelling aspects of the interview, but also what would be of interest to researchers later on. So it sort of took on a different dimension than the interview itself. I mean, one of the more fun parts for me, like for doing the podcast part, was listening to the entire interview and pulling out some of the segments like the ones you just heard. Like, you know, I love the part about Bill Johnson literally knowing what corner of the reflecting pool he was at during the March on Washington. And, you know, Sandra Kingshaw's amazing connections with the Girl Scouts, both as a young person and then as an executive. So there's some parts that were challenging, but there were also some parts that were really fun.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Adele. And thanks, Kelvin, for giving us a little bit of information about what it looks like from the grant writing perspective as well. I know that you know, certainly from the perspective of the DC Oral History Collaborative, since we do have, you know, our 3 grants programs for oral histories, you know, that's really important information as well. And I definitely think it helps, you know, to give people who are thinking about, you know, not only starting a project, but getting it funded, you know, how to kind of articulate the goals of that project as clearly as possible. I mean, I just wondered, you know, aside from, you know, some of the information that you gave us about, you know, where you can get training to be a grant writer, you know, as you were writing the applications for these oral history projects over the years, you know, did you, what was, I guess, do you have any like practical advice on how you kind of like best articulate the goals or the, you know, expected impacts of an oral history project?
I would say the best advice is that in most applications, at least for most of the ones I've handled, you are given a very tight amount of space to say what you need to say. So you really need to be concise, and you may collect a lot of information. And I would say the best thing is to know the most crucial pieces of that information, to take the encyclopedia and bring it down to a paragraph. That's the main thing that you need to know how to do.
Sure.
But that paragraph is the paragraph that can persuade someone on the other end to say that this project is a worthy project and we will support it.
Definitely, yeah. I think that that's you know, really good advice. And you're right. I mean, sometimes, you know, especially within an individual question in a narrative, there can be really limited space to get your point across. So that is definitely a skill that it takes some time to hone. And thank you, Tracy, for putting some of those, links to those grant writing resources in the chat as well. So we've talked a little bit about the process, about, how to get grants, the steps to producing oral history projects. But I also want to talk a little bit about the narratives that you've been able to collect, and some of the, stories that, some of your narrators have told. So, we know oral history preserves the memories of individual narrators, but it can also confirm, refute, color, and or enhance prevailing historical narratives. What broader historical themes do Asbury's interviews speak to? And what kinds of research questions or topics do you all believe they might be able to inform?
There were a bunch of overarching themes that have struck me, and a couple of them are, like, one is the role of HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. The different people that we featured, like James Adobe went to Talladega, Bill Johnson went to Hampton, and the other three narrative podcasts, Cardell Richardson, Josephine Baker, and Sandra Kingshaw, all went to Howard. And so that sort of shows the power and the strength of these kinds of institutions and what a difference they make in the lives of African Americans. It also can expand what people know about history. Like when Bill Johnson talked about the March on Washington, and you knew people held signs that said jobs, 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 but he literally, very shortly thereafter got a job in the DC government. I mean, the piece that's like, I didn't expect all of that to come out in the interview, and it was wonderful to be able to have such lived history through someone like that. And then on another side related to history and never knowing how the stories are going to make a difference for people, I was invited to be on a panel of the 2017 annual conference on DC history with Anna Kaplan, one of the DCOHC trainers. And we played a portion of the audio interview that I had done with Sandra Kingshaw that you heard, and in which she talked about the connections to the Girl Scouts. Well, it just so happened in the audience at that conference, at that session, was a doctoral student from Rutgers, and she approached me afterwards and said she was interested in Sandra Kingshaw's memories for use in her dissertation. Her dissertation was titled, "That Charm of All Girlhood, Black Girlhood and Girls in Washington, D.C., 1930 to 1965. And her dissertation has since become publicly available, and it cites my interview as well as other oral history interviews. So that's an example of how the oral histories can make a difference in research.
It's such an amazing connection. I think that it's really great to hear how oral histories that have been collected and archived for a really community purpose, and they've been kind of been able to be, you've been able to put them out there in these ways through conferences, and of course having them available in Dig DC, and then to be able to have researchers come and use those oral histories for some of the work that they're doing. I think that that's definitely something that we can hope for a lot of the oral histories that have been collected by your project and the other projects that have been supported by the collaborative and now exist in the archive. So yeah, I think that is that's really great to hear that. We've been talking a little bit, kind of referring to the oral history projects, but then also, we've kind of made reference so far to the podcast that was created in 2020. I'd actually like to turn to that podcast now, and just ask if you can tell us a little bit more about it, how it came about, how you were able to choose which stories to highlight in those podcast episodes. And, I know that there, is kind of an initial series, but I'm wondering if there's plans to add any more episodes in the future as well.
When we picked the stories, especially James Wright and I working on that, we wanted to really highlight aspects of African-American history that might be familiar, but were told from the perspective of people who had lived it. So like I said, with Bill Johnson for example, he was a longtime employee of DC government, and he was a cabinet member of Mayor Marion Barry. And so that was able to give people insights a bit into that kind of work. Cardell Richardson, who we also featured, made his way through the 1968 riots. He was so committed to his job as a young person that he went through the city during that time and had an amazing story of the sights and smells of what it was like to be living through that era. And He later became a high-ranking military officer who dealt with racism, but he also received prestigious presidential honor. So his story was just one that was really interesting, we thought. And then other people, their careers were highlighted, as well as the roles that might have related to Black history. We've had a lot of educators in our congregation. Josephine Baker is one example, and she is somebody who ended up being a founder of the DC public charter schools. But she had a wonderful story about her love of mythology and teaching children mythology as part of her curriculum. And that included talking about the Athena temple, and she had photographed it while visiting Greece. And that same temple was in her students' textbook. And she was able to talk about that, and having an artist in residence who helped students with printmaking so they could depict mythological figures. And then they had Greek food as refreshments. It was just a wonderful story of how she brought brought the classroom to a new level, to a new dimension. And then Jamesette Adobe, who we featured, she had traveled on a segregated train to college in the South and described what that was like. She taught first in segregated schools in DC and remembered when they became more integrated. And as I mentioned, Sandra Kingshaw's Girl Scout connections, first in Asbury's first Girl Scout troop and later as an executive. So all of these seem to be sort of prime things to include in the podcast. I do not yet know whether we're going to have future podcast episodes. I definitely would hope to keep collecting the oral histories that are possible in our congregation and finding new and different ways to tell those stories beyond the oral histories themselves. We feel really strongly that they shouldn't just sit in the cabinet somewhere, but they should be drawn out and be shared and be heard.
That's great. Yeah, that's definitely, one of the things that, we're hoping to emphasize more and more, as part of the collaborative, especially through the public projects and events grant, is that, we want to make sure that oral histories, are brought out into the public space where they can be engaged with on a regular basis. And I think the podcast that you all presented is a great example of that. One of the, kind of follow-on questions for the podcast, I know that it is available in a number of places, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, what you've done marketing wise to get the podcast out there to the community, perhaps even beyond the church community.
Well, we've learned about various forms of media, owned media, shared media, paid media, and all of them are useful and crucial in your marketing efforts. Our own media is Asbury's website, asburyumcdc.org, and our Asbury's email list. We have an email list of Asbury members and a list of guests who have attended our events and activities. And we also post ads for our events and for the podcast on our church bulletin, and we've created ads that we have emailed to people. Our shared media would be Asbury's Facebook page and the Eventbrite events page. We post the event on Facebook and Eventbrite, and Facebook and Eventbrite kind of work hand in hand, where you can learn about it on Facebook and go to Eventbrite to register. And with Eventbrite, we captured even more email lists, and which again allows us to keep in touch with people for future occasions. And we've added listings for the podcast in places such as the NBC4 community calendar, the community calendar on WETA, in the Washington Post, the Washington City Paper, community newspapers around town, and a site called Spingo, which is a listing site that reaches multiple jurisdictions within the greater Maryland, DC, Virginia area. We use there's paid advertising, but we didn't do very much of that, but we did take out some paid ads on Facebook. And Facebook allows you to pay for advertising in any setting that you choose. You can choose geographic region. You can choose to go to target people who are just visitors to your Facebook page. You can target people who have an interest that you identify. Say if you identify oral history or DC history, you can send ads to those people, or some combination. And the other part, which is a little bit out of your control, but it's very useful, is earned media, which is the word of mouth that you get from people who share what they have learned about what you're doing. And share your emails, share your tweets on Twitter, news coverage that you might get on Instagram. It's helpful because it shows that other people are looking at what you're doing and finding a value in it and wanting to participate and wanting to let other people know this is something that you want to do too.
Thanks, Kelvin. I think that's really helpful to get a better sense of for people who are thinking about doing similar works, going through the process of creating oral history or creating an oral history project and interviewing narrators, and then coming up with some sort of means to share that back with the community. It's really helpful to know the best ways to get the word out broadly about those things. I guess kind of a follow-on question from that. Do you see kind of the work that's been done at Asbury as, a potential model for other projects that might be able to be done, perhaps with other church communities or, other communities more broadly in DC? And, if so, I'm wondering if you have any examples of, anyone who's approached Asbury, and tried to find out a little bit more about your work and, how they can start a project of their own.
I know there's another church, at least one other, who's had people attend learning about what we've done because they were interested in doing the same thing. I'm not sure where their project stands, and especially with COVID, I think that could have affected some things. But I certainly hope, I feel really strongly that this is something lots of other people could do, including other congregations, because every congregation is a treasure trove of history, especially some of the more historic churches in this area and beyond. And in the end, we ended up, because we used the podcast format, instead of just reaching a few people or dozens of people that might gather in our church's fellowship hall, we could be heard all over the country and the world. And our podcast episodes are on Spotify and Amazon Music, as well as our church's website and YouTube channel. And we know that more, hundreds, if people have listened to it, even people like in Mexico and Finland and Germany. So it is a bit of work to get all of this done. It's good to have a good team that you can rely on to get it done. But I would encourage others to really give it a try. You can start small. You can, start with one interview of one person and see how it goes, or, maybe just a few people. But and I also would encourage something that we haven't done yet, but I would love to see happen more, is intergenerational activities where you might have a younger person be the person behind the camera, helping with the tech stuff. But they're also going to get to learn something from an elder in their congregation or in an organization who they might have seen across the room but didn't really know very much about, and got to spend an hour just hearing their story. I mean, think about what encouragement there could be between generations and fostering understanding, not only for those who would eventually hear or read the oral histories, but those who are making them.
And one other thing about having it shared on a podcast or having it shared on our various YouTube sites and other sites is that these stories are not just presented in a one-time event. They're always available, and there are always people who can come across it today, next week, next year, and learn from what is being said.
Great. Yeah, definitely. I think that, from my perspective, and I think the perspective of the DCOHC, your project has been one that I think, is a great example for, what's possible in community oral history projects. So I definitely appreciate you all sharing all of that. I actually do have a few more questions, but I want to make sure that, we leave some time here for a question and answer period with the participants. So, with that, I will open things up. Again, if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A. Or alternatively, if you would like to speak, you can use the option. If you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, you should see an option where you can raise your hand, and Tracy can unmute your mic so that you can go ahead and ask your question yourself.
We did get a question from Angelique Nelson. She was asking Adele, what is the name of the dissertation that you mentioned earlier in the conversation?
It is called That Charm of All Girlhood, Charm, C-H-A-R-M, That Charm of All Girlhood, Black Girlhood and Girls in Washington, D.C., 1930 to 1965.
Great, thanks. Okay, so while everybody is thinking of their questions, please do feel free to go ahead and ask. I do have just a couple of more things that I wanted to ask our panelists. I know that a lot of times oral history projects are really focused on a particular research topic, or they're focused on some sort of cultural touchstone or a historic event. I mean, it seems to me, listening through, some of the Asbury UMC oral history projects, that a lot of them, kind of return to the narrator's faith and their time in the congregation as a sort of common thread. And so, I'm wondering what impact that common thread has had on the project overall.
Yeah, it really helped to bring out that the people of our church have stories of how their faith has carried them through their personal history and their challenges and their successes. And it really, it sort of circled back to what the initial hope of the project was when we just first started, as far as what the Archives and History Committee were hoping for, and to highlight some of the various ministries of the church and how people are involved, not just by attending worship regularly. For example, Jamesette Adobe, who I've mentioned, she emphasized that though she wasn't a soloist, she was determined to contribute to Asbury's Vacation Choir, which is the one that sings during the summertime, as long as she was able to. And Josephine Baker talked about the influence and involvement of music at Asbury across generations of her family. Sandra Kingshaw, who I've mentioned related to the Girl Scouts, she recalled how important serving communion was to homebound members and volunteering at the monthly neighbor-to-neighbor breakfast that served people who often were homeless or hungry. And then Cardell Richardson talked about how his parents were very disciplined about church and Christianity, and he found some of those same values in the integrity and service in the military where he'd been serving. And Bill Johnson was an usher for decades and spoke about the importance of making people, members as well as visitors, feel welcome so they want to come back again. The interview sort of gave us not only history, but sort of life lessons and wisdom from the 5 people that were, for instance, featured in the podcast that could maybe not only help our church, but inspire other people to do better and to do more in all sorts of ways. One of the things I asked at the end of each interview was what their greatest blessing was, what they considered a greatest blessing. And some people talked about their family, some people talked about their friends, some people talked about, just overcoming in all sorts of ways. But some of the lessons I thought were really interesting, like for instance, Josephine Baker talked about being open to creative ways to draw people into our church beyond those who are currently part of our community. Cardell Richardson talked about a lesson he learned from a young minister in Kansas who said, sometimes you are people will only see Christ when they see you. Sometimes you will be the only Bible anyone will ever read. And Jamesette Adobe said, and I'm a person who believes when you have blessings in specific areas, you have it for a purpose and you utilize it, because if you do not care for your blessing or use your blessing, you may lose it.
Thanks, Adele.
So we do have one question from Marilyn Jenkins. She asked, can you share your interview questions? We are embarking on the same type of oral history.
If she emails somebody at DCOHC, they can send it to me and I could share with her some of those. Yes. What organization did she say she's with?
She did not, but I will put my email in the chat for her to send me her information.
Yeah, Some of it is basic curiosity that's going to come up. Even if you have a list of questions, you should always be open to jumping in and asking something else. Like, I didn't know I was going to ask Bill Johnson about the March on Washington, and that ended up being like one of the most interesting parts of that interview. But it also is really important to have a sense of what you want to cover, and maybe even have kind of sections if you're dealing with, you know, history of the organization, like when the person was born, what kind of jobs they had, what kind of hobbies they had. There are certain things that you definitely want to make sure you hit on, even as you're open to asking questions you weren't planning on based on what they say.
Great. Thank you for your question, Marilyn. I also want to, just kind of put it out there that, we definitely appreciate any more questions you might have for the panelists. If you have any questions about the Oral History Collaborative, we'd be happy to, answer those as well. If you are thinking about starting a project, as Marilyn is, we would also like to, give you the chance to, raise your hand, unmute, and just tell us a little bit about your project. We'd be happy to hear about, possible new projects that people are thinking about doing in DC as well.
Jackie, you can go ahead and speak when you're ready.
Oh, thank you so much. First of all, this was so fascinating and so interesting. Back in the day, I worked for the DC Chamber of Commerce. I was the assistant director for tourism, and I coordinated the 3 tours that went through DC. And they spoke to the history, much of the Civil War history of Washington, D.C., with the exception of Anacostia. The Anacostia tour was very interesting because I ran across something in my research that was related to Aboriginal Black Indians in Washington, D.C. So I've been talking with my students about that. I do children's theater in Ward 8, talking with my students about that, and we've just been continuing research over the years. I would love to continue this project under the Humanities Council, but I don't know if that's something that the Humanities Council, that subject would be something that the Humanities would be interested in. So that's my question. Thank you. I'm going to go back on mute.
Great, thanks for that, Jackie. And certainly any project about a community in DC, untold stories in DC, narratives in DC that can be researched, interpreted, and documented and preserved using oral history, are of interest to the DC Oral History Collaborative and Humanities DC. I will say, just kind of putting it out there for everybody that the DCOHC grant cycles for FY21 have concluded. The deadlines for those are passed now, but the expectation is that the project will continue next year and beyond. So those grant programs will come again in FY22. And we do also have our training opportunities that are coming up as well. So, one initial step, if you're interested in doing an oral history project of this kind, might be to sign up for one of those training opportunities. And they are pretty intensive. The workshop is three sessions, and it's a total of 8 hours of instruction. But it's a really great way to be introduced to oral history, to kind of start to get involved with the collaborative and to learn more about the process. So I would definitely recommend doing that.
So I have a question from Akua. When you first started your oral history project to now, how many oral history interviews have you collected? And then there's a second part. How has the focus of your oral history project evolved over time?
We have 26 interviews now of different people from Asbury United Methodist Church, and it's evolved over time because initially we maybe focused a little more on how people fit into our church's history, and their life stories and questions about that were kind of towards the end of the interview and kind of afterthought. And now it's like we've developed more of a life history kind of interview, where we ask them start with where they were born and move into retirement, all the way to retirement, as well as, you know, the career in between, as well as their work in the church and beyond it. So it's become more expansive over time, which has allowed us to have lots of different stories that we were able to share.
Is there another question, Tracy?
I'm not sure if Marilyn still wanted to speak. She had her hand raised, but then she put it down. Marilyn, I'll give you the opportunity to speak if you'd like to.
Oh, no, that's all right. I'm just the one who from St. George's Episcopal Church, who is going to start our oral history. And thank you for all the information about what it took for you to do it, because we understand that that's going to take a lot of effort on our part to do this. So I appreciate all that. We are doing the same thing. And the reason we're doing it is, I think, the same reasons, because our population is getting older, and they've lived from with this church since 1930. And as a generational church, all the information resides with them and their experience in DC during this time frame. And we're looking for the exact same kind of information and to hold it for them, not only for them, but then for others to research as well. So thank you very much for this.
I just want to say that's great news, Marilyn, and wish you the best with it. And, you know, I'm happy to talk to you sometime about it, because there is a lot involved, but it's also just a very rich opportunity for you. So you haven't done any yet. You're just getting ready to get started, huh?
Well, we put in for the for a DC Humanities grant. So we're waiting here.
Okay, that's great.
Right. And then we're hoping that this will spawn for our Episcopal diocese here in DC, for the other traditional Black Episcopal churches to do this as well. And then maybe go from there, from DC to our national church with our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, and getting all of the churches in the United States to get that done, so that we have a history not only here in DC, but that the Episcopal Church can hold all of them together in one place.
There's such a rich history within the Episcopal Church. You're right. That's a great idea.
Yep. All right. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Thank you, Marilyn. All right. Well, please do, you know, feel free. If there's any more questions, you know, please, you know, do put them in the Q&A. Raise your hand so Tracy can give you access. But you know, have just one more, you know, kind of closing question from me for Adelle and Kelvin. Just really simply, you know, are there any other tips, you know, for people who are starting out that you would suggest?
I would say on the grant realm, there are lots of pieces of information you are going to need to fill out your application. So it's useful to collect them and have them on hand and at the ready. As Jesper mentioned, that the grant cycle for DCOHC's grants has concluded, but if you want to step in next year, it would be wise to collect the things that you need to have, basic information about who your organization's offices are, your address. Some grant organizations ask for something that's called a Dun and Bradstreet number. So if you don't already have one, you should go ahead and apply and get one. Some organizations want proof of your IRS status. Some organizations want, or some definitely from the, if you're applying for the DC grants from the DC government, they want proof that you are what's called in clean hands, that you owe no bills or have any outstanding liens with the government. So there are just many pieces that you need to have, and it's better to get those all ready to go so that when the application opens, then you can just get right started and not have to spend time during the period where the grant is open to find the things that you need to have.
And I'd add, there's a lot that you should consider. That's just sort of the personal side of oral history, and also the detail-oriented side. Like for one thing that hasn't come up yet in our discussion that I should mention is there are consent forms that you have to have people sign, and those are what allow you to, for instance, look at the DC Library's now online collection that includes some of the Asbury interviews. That allows them to be up there because people gave permission. And so you have to check in with your narrators about that and make sure that you know right up front that they're going to be signing this form and that they would still have access to it, but other people would have access to it as well. Also, you need to be patient with yourself and with your narrators. There are times during the interview when you just need to say absolutely nothing. You have to just stare at them and smile at them and nod and not say anything, because you don't need your uh-huhs and and oh, in the interview, because it makes for much less exciting audio when you add that kind of thing in there. So you just kind of need to be quiet, but you also need to tell them that. Say, it's not that I'm not interested when I don't say anything. It's that I want to give you a chance to say whatever it is you wish. And it gives them a chance. Sometimes people speak more slowly. Sometimes people think for a minute before they say the next amazing thing. So you have to kind of be real patient about deciding when you move on to the next question. And you need to be prepared to ask the next question when they are ready to go on, and always be willing to go back and ask more to clarify, like I mentioned before. So it's a wonderful opportunity, and you just have to realize it's two human beings interacting together, and you just never know quite what's going to come out of it, but it's usually something wonderful.
That's great. Yeah, I really, appreciate you thinking through, some of those, tips about how you kind of elicit the stories from your narrators as well. I think that is something that, we didn't talk quite as much about during the, moderated part of the discussion, but, it is kind of really the heart of what oral history is, that interview encounter between the interviewer and the interviewee. So I'm glad that you brought that up, Adelle. Thanks. Let's see,
we do have one more question, and it's from Akua. Are you able to share what other funding/grant resources, in addition to the DCOHC, that you were able to gain support for your oral history project?
As far as the oral history project specifically, we did not draw on any other grant funding. We had the support of Asbury United Methodist Church, particularly the Archives and History Committee, for information, for contacts, and our historian, James Wright, served as the, what's the title? Humanitarian Scholar for the podcast project, because that particular grant required someone to be a historical expert, and he very much guided us through the narratives that people were giving us and the context of the times that they were talking about. And one thing that we were also careful to do is to check the accuracy of people's recollections, which isn't required, but it is, since we are speaking of history, we want history to be accurate and complete.
Yeah, and I should note that even though our grant is all in and been a success and we have the podcast up, I am still going through the transcripts. And I just had a conversation with somebody in the last week checking on how to spell the nickname of one of the people. And the person I reached her aunt, who's like in her 90s, who found a piece of correspondence, so she could tell us exactly how to spell it. And so there are times in the transcripts that you put things in brackets to either correct people or to just make it more accurate. And that's kind of the work that is still a little bit ongoing, but I'm hoping soon to be done with that and be able to share the documents with not only the Asbury archives, but also the individual narrators or their families that we now have transcripts of their interviews.
But I would also make a case. There are two sites, grants.gov and candid.org, which are places that you can go to search for organizations that are offering grants. So you can find organizations that are offering funding for different purposes. And a lot of organizations that are offering fundings are private organizations, and a lot of them are not listed anywhere. A lot of them don't have websites, but they can be found through places that are specifically about finding grant funding.
I just learned another answer to the question that Marilyn had, and that is that I think in the list in the chat, there has been the Dig DC library link. And on that, you will find 5, at least, of the 2018 interviews that were funded with the DC Oral History Collaborative's assistance. And one of the pieces in there for each of the narrators should be the transcript. And it actually might be better for you to look at that, because you could then see what was asked, how it was answered, and maybe from that figure out what questions you might want to ask for your particular congregation.
Oh, and to piggyback on that, again, on the question of searching for funding, one thing to try is to look at organizations in your searching on grants.gov or in candid.org, is organizations that are similar to you that have received the kind of grants that you've got. And conversely, organizations that you know of that have received grants, you can search and say, okay, if another church got a grant, what other places has that grant or given funding to?
Great. Well, thank you for answering. Thank you for answering that question. I think that I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. So if there aren't any more, I think that we can conclude. I'd like to thank you all for attending this first DC Oral History Collaborative Coffee Chat. We do hope that it becomes a monthly series. Tentatively, we expect to do another session of the Coffee Chat on May 15th. But hopefully we'll be able to provide more details on the HDC website and on our social media as early as next week. So we do hope that you'll join us again. We hope to continue to feature all the great work that the DCOHC project directors have done, over the last few years. And thank you again to Adelle and Kelvin for sharing their work with us today. Thank you again to Billy and Rhonda for providing ASL interpretive services for us. And, big thanks to Tracy for running the Q&A and getting the webinar set up for us. We definitely hope to see you all in a future session, and hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. You have anything else that you wanted to add before we sign off, Adelle or Kelvin?
Just thank you very much for having us.
And thank you, and I'm glad that we were able to help other people with what we can tell them.
Great, thank you.